Have you ever wondered what happens after you die? It's a question that doesn't have a clear answer, and honestly, who wants to think about it? Most people avoid it like the plague. But when you're out on the bleeding edge of life, staring death right in the face every damn day, like the soldiers who fought in the Great War, that luxury is out the window. Death was right there, an omnipresent specter stalking every moment, waiting for its turn. But not every encounter with death was what you'd expect. Some of those men, they didn't just die. They dodged death in ways that defy all logic. What they saw can't be explained. No scientific theory can account for it, and maybe that's the point. We're left to speculate. Was it just a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by the exhaustion of battle? Or maybe, just maybe, it was something supernatural. And don't even get me started on the real question. Do you believe in ghosts? Or angels? Or demons? Because, my friend, this story is about men who saw death coming before it even knocked. In the trenches, death wasn't just an event. It was a constant companion. The ground, drenched with blood, churned with the bodies of the fallen. You didn't have to be a psychic to feel the eyes of your comrades staring back at you, lifeless, just waiting for you to be the next. But these men, the ones who survived, some of them swore that they didn't just see death, they met it face to face. But the way they dodged it? Something was pulling strings. Something beyond this world. Take the case of Will Barnes, for example. He was a Canadian soldier, a seasoned vet of the war, and yet sleep had become a rare commodity. It didn't matter how tired he was, sleep would come in bursts, only to be shattered by an incoming shell, a comrade snoring, or the damn rats that never gave you a moment's peace. Yet, tonight, sleep was winning. His mind was foggy, and his body too tired to fight anymore. That's when he felt it, a presence. At first, Will thought it was just another soldier coming to rouse him for a shift. But when the man's boots squelched through the mud, Will felt an odd, cold chill run down his spine. This wasn't just any soldier. This man was smiling down at him, and that smile, so familiar, so eerie, belonged to someone he hadn't seen in over 2 years. "Steve," Will whispered, his voice cracking. The man standing above him was his dead brother, Steve, lost in battle all those years ago. But here he was, as clear as day. "Get up," Steve said, his voice low and firm, like it always was. "Grab your gear and follow me." Without a word, Will obeyed, confusion and fear battling for dominance in his chest. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and followed his brother through the winding network of trenches, their boots slapping against the wet earth. The further they went, though, the more uneasy Will felt. He tried speaking to Steve, asking questions, making small talk, but his brother never answered. He didn't even look back. Steve just marched ahead, stiff and unwavering. But then, as they rounded a corner, Steve vanished. One moment, he was there, a solid presence, and the next, the trench was empty. Will called out, frantic, but no response came. He was alone now, deep in the muck and mire of war. No one to talk to, no one to guide him. Exhaustion hit him like a ton of bricks, and for the first time in what felt like years, sleep finally took him, pulling him into its merciless embrace. When Will awoke, the day was already in full swing. But then came the shock. His dugout, where he had just been hours earlier, was gone. Destroyed. There was nothing left but rubble and carnage. His comrades, those who had been in the dugout with him, had been torn apart in the blast. They were gone. And Will, he was still alive. He had been spared, somehow, saved by something beyond comprehension. The memory of Steve's touch, that warmth from a brother long dead, stayed with him. He didn't know what it was, an angel? A ghost? Or maybe some twisted trick of his mind. But there was no doubt about it. Something had reached out from beyond the grave and pulled him from the jaws of death. The battlefield was a haze of smoke and dust, where the cries of the dying mingled with the sounds of war. Among the chaos, there was an oddity, a figure standing unmoved between the lines. She wore a vibrant blue skirt and a bonnet, her face worn and weathered, eyes tired as if she'd witnessed far too much. For a moment, even the soldiers were silent. unsure of what to make of her. The Germans had stopped firing, a lull falling over the madness. One soldier squinted into the distance. "She knows there's a war going on, right?" Another muttered, "Could be shell shock. Who knows? We've got to get her out of there." All right, but what are we gonna do?" "She's just standing there," someone grumbled, eyes nervously flicking toward the figure. "Hang on a sec, I'll go have a look." The soldier's voice was sharp, but there was no hesitation. "You know any French?" The rest of the squad stood frozen, watching him as he stood up and moved toward the woman. A wave of confusion passed through the men. The soldier paused, peering through the haze. His face changed the moment he saw her again. His expression shifted, a deep sense of dread creeping into his features. He took a faltering step, then another. No, it can't be," he murmured. "Hey, what's going on?" "Get back here," his comrades shouted, but the soldier seemed not to hear them, his focus entirely on the figure ahead. Slowly, he removed his helmet and staggered toward her, as if drawn by some invisible force. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words that sealed his fate. "That's my mother. I think she's come for me." The battlefield seemed to go still. Smoke clung to the air, wrapping around the soldiers in a shroud of uncertainty. The woman's gaze remained cold, unyielding. She didn't speak, only watched. The young soldier moved farther into the open, his body no longer his own. His comrades screamed after him, desperate to pull him back. But he didn't listen. There was no turning back for him now. Within moments, an explosion shook the earth beneath them. The blast was quick, too quick for the soldier to react. The men around him froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. When the dust settled, all that remained of their comrade was a mangled mess of blood and bone. The woman was gone, swept away by the haze of smoke and confusion, as if she had never been there at all. Two soldiers approached the scene, their hearts heavy with a sense of foreboding. The woman in the blue skirt was nowhere to be found, and their fallen comrade lay lifeless before them, the remnants of his helmet a grim reminder of his final moments. "Was that real?" one of them muttered, his voice trembling. "Did you see her too?" The other soldier shook his head, unable to comprehend the situation. I don't know what we saw." But as the haze lifted and the battle raged on, a deeper unease lingered. In the hearts of the men who had witnessed it, a question hung in the air. Had the soldier truly seen his mother? Or had death somehow reached out to claim him, in the form of a ghost or a premonition? The superstitions of soldiers were well known. They carried small tokens of luck, a coin, a letter, a scrap of cloth from home, something to ward off the horrors of war. For some, these trinkets were a lifeline, a tiny thread connecting them to a world beyond the chaos. For others, the belief in fate or the supernatural ran deeper. It was said that soldiers who felt an ominous presence or a sense of impending doom were often correct in their foreboding. Corporal Albert Davy of the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company had always been a soldier of iron will. The tunneling engineers were tasked with the most harrowing of missions, digging beneath enemy lines, planting explosives, and hoping they didn't meet a swift end beneath a collapsing tunnel. Davy had survived countless close calls, a testament to his skill and resolve. But as the war drew to a close, a strange feeling washed over him. He felt it deep in his bones, a certainty that his time was up. In October 1918, as the war neared its end, Davy became more withdrawn, his usual confidence replaced by an unshakable dread. When his comrades noticed, he didn't have an explanation. "It's like something is coming for me," he would say. "I can't explain it." One night, before a major offensive, Davy approached his commanding officer, Captain Oliver Holmes Woodward, and asked a strange favor. "I need you to take care of my things, sir. If anything happens to me, will you make sure they get sent home?" Davy's voice was quiet, but there was a finality to it. "Don't be foolish, Davy," the captain replied, trying to reassure him. "We all stand the same chance. Keep your head, man." But Davy only nodded, his face pale. "Please, sir. I know my time has come." The next morning, as dawn broke over the battlefield, Corporal Davy went forward with his comrades, preparing for the push across the Somos Canal. A shell fell amidst them. Davy didn't make it. Captain Woodward later reflected on the eerie premonition of his best NCO. "I'd heard of such things," he wrote. "But to see it firsthand, to watch a man with so much life in him accept death so calmly, it was a strange feeling. A feeling I never forgot." As the men lay in wait, preparing for the inevitable, Corporal Davy remained the calm anchor in their midst. He was the type of soldier who embodied fearlessness, a man who seemed untouched by the chaos surrounding him. Throughout the war, he had never faltered in his duties, executing them with unshakable precision and inspiring confidence in his comrades. There was no sign of panic or fear in his actions, not a hint of hesitation that could suggest a faltering resolve. Even as the war raged on around them, Davy's poise remained unbroken. Over a century has passed since the guns of the Great War fell silent, and yet the myths, legends, and supernatural tales born from the trenches still echo through the corridors of time. Historians and storytellers alike are drawn to these spectral stories, passed down from the men who lived through them. Even as old men, far from their days of war, these soldiers never once wavered in recounting the eerie, inexplicable happenings they witnessed. The horrors they encountered on the battlefield shattered their youth, but in their seasoned, hardened hearts, these men were molded into weapons of war, soldiers whose senses were honed to an almost supernatural degree, able to perceive even the faintest shift in their surroundings. What are we to make of it, then, when these men, trained to survive in the most brutal conditions, saw the faces of their long-lost comrades staring at them from the darkness, their forms appearing like ghosts from beyond the grave? How do we interpret the prophetic visions that plagued them during the night, hinting at an inescapable, grisly fate? These men, hardened by war and shaped by its relentless demands, saw something more than just death. They saw something that whispered of what lay just beyond. Unfortunately, this incredible generation has long since passed, leaving only their testimonies and the unsolved mysteries of the front line. The line where they not only faced death head-on, but perhaps glimpsed what lay beyond it. Pause. Oh, sorry, I'm still recording. What did you say? I'm still recording? All right, stand by. A thick layer of dust hung heavy in the air around him as he stood alone in the church. The faint echo of distant sounds blended with the oppressive silence, leaving only a sense of stillness in the air. "Wait, what?" he muttered under his breath, realizing he had left the mic on. He chuckled to himself, adding a note to the ongoing story, a reflection of the little details that kept his audience engaged. Anyway, sorry for the interruption, folks. Just a quick update here as I finish recording this. Been a rough patch, as you know. Some things changed on the channel side of things. Unfortunately, with the recent shutdown, I had to let some people go, at least for now, while I get things back on track financially. Big thank you, though, to Jake Howard, the guest writer who helped out with the script for this episode. Jake's not only a great researcher, but a fantastic storyteller, and I know you all will appreciate the work he's done here. If you liked this episode, you've got Jake to thank. He also has a published book, One Day Over Germany. Check it out if you're into history and war stories. You can find the link in the description. He continued to offer heartfelt thanks, acknowledging those who had stuck with him during the tough times, especially his Patreon supporters, whose dedication had made a significant difference in keeping the content alive. To my YouTube channel members and patrons, you guys are incredible. I truly appreciate all your support. For those who came on recently, thank you for stepping up when things were uncertain. You've been a huge help. I'm working my way through emails, messages, and all the other responses, so if you haven't heard from me yet, just know I'll get to you soon. I appreciate your patience. With a final note of gratitude, he signed off. Take care of yourselves. God be with you, wherever you are, whatever you're dealing with. See you in the next episode. The microphone clicked off, the room falling into a heavy silence once more. As the days passed, the eerie stillness of the church where he stood was a stark contrast to the chaos that once consumed the war zone. His thoughts drifted back to the front lines, to the faces of his comrades, now lost in time. The echoes of their conversations, their laughter, and their struggles haunted him in ways that words could not fully describe. He had learned long ago to live with the weight of their absence, but there were times, like now, when their memories felt so vivid, it was as if they were right there beside him. The dusty air around him seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories, untold and unfinished, lingering in the spaces between breaths. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, some unseen force, was still at work, connecting him to those days, those men, those horrors. He had always believed that the line between life and death was thinner than anyone realized. War had taught him that, not in abstract terms, but in brutal, visceral lessons. Every scar, every loss, was a reminder of that razor-thin edge between existence and oblivion. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the church windows, he sat alone in the silence, his mind racing with fragments of memories that refused to be forgotten. The war was over, but its imprint on his soul would never fade. The battles he fought, the decisions he made, the lives he saved, and those he couldn't, were all part of him now. But it wasn't just the memories of the battlefield that lingered. It was the strange, inexplicable experiences that still haunted him in the quiet moments, the ones that defied logic, that hinted at something beyond the reach of human understanding. He had seen things in the dark corners of war, things that no soldier should ever have to witness. Things that made him question everything he had ever believed. He had heard whispers on the wind, seen figures in the distance, felt presences that were both foreign and familiar at the same time. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake in a cold sweat, the sounds of footsteps echoing in his ears, footsteps that weren't his own. What does it mean? He couldn't shake the question. It had been years since the war ended, and yet, it still gnawed at him. The faces of the fallen soldiers who appeared in his dreams, were they trying to tell him something? Or was it just the mind playing tricks on a man who had seen too much? There were no answers, only the silence of the church, the weight of the past pressing down on him like an invisible force. A knock at the door broke his reverie, pulling him back to the present. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before standing up to answer. As he opened the door, he found himself face to face with an old acquaintance, a man who looked just as weathered by time and war as he did. "Jake?" he asked, surprised but not entirely shocked. Jake Howard, the guest writer from the episode, stood before him, wearing a worn leather jacket and an expression that suggested he had come here with a purpose. Jake had always been a man of action, even when the war had ended. Despite his profession as a consultant in the Toronto film industry, his passion for history, war, and the strange phenomena that often surrounded it never waned. "I know it's been a while," Jake said, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I needed to talk. I've been working on something I think you'll want to hear." The cryptic nature of Jake's words immediately piqued his interest. "What is it?" Jake motioned for him to step aside, entering the small room. He glanced around, seemingly lost in thought for a moment before turning back to face him. "I've been digging deeper into the stories you've told me about the war, about those strange things that happened. The faces in the dark, the footsteps that weren't yours. I think I've found something," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. He felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Jake pulled out a small, worn notebook from his jacket pocket. The pages were yellowed with age, and the cover was frayed from years of use. "This belonged to a soldier who fought with you during the war," Jake said, flipping through the pages. "I've been trying to track down the source of some of the stories you've shared, and I think I've finally found something that ties it all together." He frowned, taking the notebook from Jake's hands. The soldier's name was unfamiliar, but the notes within were oddly familiar. They spoke of strange occurrences, visions of soldiers who had died, whispering voices in the night, and fleeting glimpses of figures that shouldn't have been there. The stories mirrored his own experiences, down to the smallest details. The same unease, the same sense of something being just out of reach. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, flipping through more pages. "These stories, these experiences, they're too similar to my own." Jake nodded. "Exactly. That's why I think you need to take a look at this." There's more here than just war stories. I think there's something else at play, something that ties everything together. Something supernatural. He stared at the notebook in disbelief. He had always brushed off the strange occurrences as the product of a mind pushed to the brink, but the more he read, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that there was more to these experiences than mere imagination. The faces in the darkness, the whispers, the premonitions, they were all too real, too persistent to be ignored. "I don't know what to make of this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Jake leaned in closer, his eyes intense. "I think it's time we find out what it all means." There are more stories like this, stories that don't fit the usual narrative of war. And I believe there's a connection between them. A connection that could change everything we know about the war and what came after. The weight of Jake's words settled heavily in the room. He had always suspected there was more to the war than what the world had been told, but now, standing in the presence of this discovery, he couldn't help but wonder if he had stumbled upon something that could shatter everything he thought he understood about life, death, and the things that linger in the space between. The silence that followed was thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as Jake's words lingered in the air. The weight of what he had just revealed felt like a tangible presence, pressing down on the room, the old walls creaking under the pressure. He sat there, staring at the notebook in his hands, the pages filled with notes and sketches that mirrored the strange occurrences he had witnessed during the war. Jake's voice broke through the stillness again, low and steady. "You've seen it, haven't you? Those faces, those shadows. They're not just memories or hallucinations. There's something else. Something unfinished." He couldn't deny it. He had seen those faces, those lost comrades who should have been long gone. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when his mind was too tired to resist, he would catch glimpses of them, standing in the periphery of his vision, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. And sometimes, just before sleep claimed him, he could hear their whispers, quiet but persistent, like a constant hum in the back of his mind. But what did it mean? What were they trying to tell him? His fingers traced the edges of the notebook, the paper worn and fragile, as though it too had been touched by the ghosts of the past. As he flipped through the pages, the words began to blur together. They spoke of sightings, unseen enemies, unnatural forces moving through the trenches, and soldiers who had vanished into thin air, never to be found again. The soldiers who wrote these notes had experienced the same chilling moments, the same inexplicable sights, and like him, they had never found a way to understand what was happening. It was as if the war itself had become a conduit for something darker, something that went beyond human comprehension. He looked up at Jake, meeting his gaze. "You really think this is something supernatural? That all this, the visions, the faces, the whispers, wasn't just stress or madness or whatever else they told us in the debriefings?" Jake nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I do. And I think it's time we looked into it. There's more to the story than we've been told. This notebook, these notes, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Whoever the soldier was, he knew something. Something that could explain what happened to all of us. Why we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Why we felt like we were never truly alone, even when we were miles from any enemy." The words hung heavy between them. It was a chilling thought, one that sent a cold shiver down his spine. What if there was something out there, something beyond the natural world, that had been feeding off their fear, their pain, their loss? What if the war hadn't just been a conflict between nations, but a battle with something far older and more sinister? But there were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies. It was too much to process, and yet, somehow, it felt like the answers were just within reach. He couldn't ignore the feeling that this was only the beginning, that there was more to discover, more to understand about the strange occurrences that haunted him. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he said, his voice hoarse. Jake's gaze softened. No one's ever really ready for something like this. But sometimes, we don't have a choice. The past has a way of catching up with us. And if we don't face it, really face it, it'll keep coming for us. Sooner or later. The words felt like a warning, But they also carried an undeniable truth. He had seen it with his own eyes, how the past never truly let go. How it crept into the present when you least expected it, reminding you that there were things beyond your control, things that defied all logic and reason. And no matter how hard he tried to bury those memories, they always found a way to resurface, like the faces of his fallen comrades, still haunting him in the shadows. Jake stood up and paced around the room, his fingers tapping on the sides of the old notebook. "I've been doing some research," he said, "and I think I've found a connection. A story about the soldiers who saw things like this, saw faces of the dead in the trenches. It's not just war stories. There's something else at play here, something that's been around for a long time." He leaned in, his voice lowering even further. "There are whispers, you see. Whispers of something older than the war itself. Something that's been feeding off the chaos, the violence, and the grief for centuries. Maybe longer. This soldier, the one who wrote these notes, he wasn't just fighting the enemy on the battlefield. He was fighting something else. Something that the rest of the world will never understand." The words felt like a heavy weight in his chest. Could it be true? Was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of the war? Something that had always been there, feeding off the suffering of soldiers, feeding off the death that seemed to follow them like a shadow? "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if what you're saying is true, if there really is something out there, something supernatural, then we're not just dealing with the aftermath of a war. We're dealing with something much bigger. Something that doesn't care about borders or politics or even the lives of soldiers." Jake nodded gravely. "Exactly. And that's why we have to find out what it is. We have to go back to where it all started." His heart skipped a beat. Back to the front lines? Jake met his gaze, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "Yes. We're going back to the place where it all began. To uncover the truth. And to put an end to whatever's been haunting us all these years." The thought of returning to the front lines sent a wave of unease through him. He had left that part of his life behind, buried it as best as he could. But deep down, he knew that the past never truly stayed buried. It always had a way of resurfacing, forcing you to confront it, whether you were ready or not. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he repeated, his voice barely audible. Jake's hand rested on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We've both been haunted by the same thing. And now, it's time to face it head on. We have to find the answers. For all the soldiers who never made it back. For those who still can't escape what they saw. And for us, because we can't keep running forever." A sense of resolve settled over him, mixed with a deep, gnawing fear. He didn't know what he was about to uncover, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had lost. The war might have ended, but the real battle was only just beginning.